Hello, Tor Lacey here. This is a reading from the textbook Historical Geology, a free online textbook for historical geology courses. The chapter is Evolution, Part 1, The Theory. The chapter begins with an illustration demonstrating the evolutionary connections between different species. Comparison between the fins of lobed-finned fishes and legs of early tetrapods. Tetrapods being animals that walk on four legs. And by careful analysis of the anatomy of the bones, we see that they are related, but are now different species. So this is a good example of evolution. Key concepts. At the end of this chapter, students should be able to define biological evolution, distinguish between macro and microevolution, distinguish between different patterns that occur in nature as a result of evolutionary processes, describe how life is organized using systematics, identify some of the key ideas and players in the history of evolutionary theory, identify the key paradigms in the development of evolutionary theory, identify the ways that genes are passed on through various forms of inheritance to the next generation. Going back to this word paradigm, that means like a very important unifying idea that is part of a theory in this case, in case you didn't know what that word means. Evolution, patterns in the biosphere. The biosphere is replete with patterns. This is true not only in the ecosystems around us today, but also in our planet's fossil past. Some of these patterns include some of the basic things we learn about in introductory biology courses. These patterns force scientists to ask questions. Why are ecosystems arranged in a hierarchy with primary producers on the bottom and omnivorous organisms on top? Why is there so much shared DNA among life forms that seem so different, even across different environments? Why do so many life forms that live such different lives have such similar features? Why do humans and reptiles share four limbs? Why do both butterflies and birds have wings? Why do some features or organisms not have clear functions? Why do I need to put on a jacket, a hat, and gloves to venture out into the winter cold? One common pattern in the living world is governed by the mathematical Fibonacci sequence. This simple sequence of numbers describes an amazing variety of phenomena, with names like the golden ratio and the golden spiral. It can also be used to describe breeding patterns in organisms and subsequent geometric population growth. The formula for the Fibonacci sequence, AN equals 2AN, 2 times AN that is, simply describes a doubling with each calculation. Over time, it is possible to use this simple formula to predict the number of organisms present after any number of generations, if resources are available and population growth is unchecked. Also predicted by this equation is the Fibonacci spiral, as seen below in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower and the whorls of an ammonite. These spiral patterns are based upon a curve that, while growing, keeps its shape and central angle at all times. The Giga image here has a fossil of an ammonite embedded in the rock here. So we see that nicely. And exemplified here is the Fibonacci spiral. Evolutionary theory presents us with answers to these questions. Using it as a framework, we can answer these questions and more. Evolution explains the observable patterns in the living world around us. It also explains the patterns we see in the fossil past. Evolution means change over time. It is used in many ways and in many fields. Biological evolution is the mutation of genetic material through generations of offspring. Such evolution from one generation to another does not follow a trajectory. It is the result of the accumulation of changes in DNA. Such modifications occur at different rates in different groups of organisms and at different moments in time. But they are only observable when mutations in an organism's DNA, its genotype, are physically expressed through its phenotype or appearance. Such changes in genes can lead to longer horns, more toes, improved leg bone structure for walking on dry land, and bipedalism in primates. These are just a few examples. Billions of years ago, when microbes were the only living things on the planet, such exotic future modifications were not inevitable or predictable. Our own species, Homo sapiens, was never guaranteed existence. Still, we are here, and we are able to contemplate questions of origins. You are reading this chapter, and that is a result of evolutionary change. Ultimately, evolution tells us that we are all related. Yes, humans are related to one another, but humans are also related to sponges, flowering plants, and bacteria. All life on this planet is descended from a common ancestor and was then teased out into a million distinct evolutionary trajectories. Some of these probably looked and act pretty similar to the most ancient ancestral forms of life. These features are said to be evolutionarily conserved, and some are extremely different, and they are highly derived. Descent with modification is the essential idea of evolution. The Trophic Pyramid is based upon observations of food web or energy transfer as observed in living ecosystems. So at the bottom of the pyramid here, we have decay detrivores or heterotrophs, which are breaking down material or causing decay, which contributes to nutrients in soil, which are utilized by plants. Plants, in turn, are utilized by insects and animals that are feeding on some part of the plant. In turn, those plant-eating animals may be fed upon or utilized for energy by animals that eat the plant-eating animals. And in turn, there might be higher order or secondary predators that feed upon the primary predators. And this gives us a food web or food pyramid or trophic pyramid as is referred to here. Biological evolution helps us understand the living world around us. It helps us understand ourselves as a species. It helps us explain the patterns we see in fossils contained in rocks. Evolutionary change is observable everywhere. The development of antibiotic resistance among bacteria, a stroll through a wooded area that will reveal an ecosystem of food webs, or an intricate daily dances performed between organisms that have evolved together over time. A decomposing organism is broken down by other organisms specially adapted for that purpose. Parasites exist within your body, your skin, that you rely on for life, but yet never meet as you would a friend or neighbor. Evolution can explain all of this and more, because it is still occurring today. We can observe its process in action. As a theory that has been itself evolving for more than a century, it is built upon a robust foundation of evidence from the fossil record, biochemistry, observations of naturalists, and observations still being made in labs, remote tropical forests, and even on other planets. Evolutionary theory binds all these threads of evidence together into a coherent view of life. There is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been organically breathed into a few forms or into one. and that whilst this planet has gone cycling according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wondrous have been and are being evolved. That's from Charles Darwin, from his famous book, Origin of Species, in 1859. Systematics organizing life, macro and micro evolution. The fossil record provides excellent evidence for the history of life. In particular, fossils reveal macroevolution, or how species have evolved over time. Microevolutionary change, or changes in gene frequency on very small scales, also occurred in fossils when they were alive. However, fossils do not preserve such change. Macroevolutionary change recorded by fossils shows visible variation in both physical features, body fossils, and behaviors, trace fossils, as well as the introduction of new organisms. We find that not only is all life related, but that life has evolved through common biochemical means over the course of more than 4 billion years. This evidence allows us to build models for how evolution occurred in the past and insights into how it is still occurring today. One such model is the tree of life. Speciation, or origination, happens at different scales of time, depending on the time it takes to produce offspring. It happens very quickly in bacteria, but quite slowly in larger animals. Because macroevolutionary change can take a great deal of time, the best place to look for evidence of this change is in the fossil record. Macroevolution can be thought of as the accumulation of microevolutionary changes, which include various kinds of genetic mutation processes and trait selection. These processes operate at much smaller scales and do not get recorded in fossilization. Despite not being visible in the fossil record, we can study how they work today and apply uniformitarian principles to understand how they must have worked in the past. Uniformitarian, or uniformitarianism, is a fundamental principle of geology, and one that is especially important for historical geology. It refers to our observations of biologic, physical, chemical processes happening today, and then applying those same principles to what must have been happening in Earth's ancient past. We have no reason to believe otherwise. So in this case, the sentence, despite not being visible in the fossil record, we can study how they work today, and then this allows us to make reasonable assumptions about how things must have happened in the ancient past when we couldn't see them. Here is the One Zoom Tree of Life Explorer. So this is rather fun to play around with, and I would take a few minutes if I were you, or longer, because you could probably spend all day on this if you wanted to, messing around with this and getting a feel for how organisms are connected. So I typed in dolphin here, and I'm just going to hit enter, and I get a list of different types of dolphins. So I'll hit common dolphin and see what happens. You can see this is zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. I'm getting way down to dolphins here. So as I zoom back out, you can see how many organisms are connected to one another to bring us eventually to dolphins. Way out on the far reaches of that limb of the tree. Linnaeus and His Method. People have long organized and classified organisms. The beginning of recorded classification go back to Aristotle with his observations of invertebrates while living on the islands of Greece. His method of classifying organisms began by separating animals from plants. He would go on to separate animals into two further groups that we still use loosely today. Anhyma, animals without blood or invertebrates, and Enhyma, animals with blood or vertebrates. This system would persist, like so much of Aristotelian thought, through the Middle Ages and right up to the time of Linnaeus. Classification of organisms in the years just prior to Linnaeus' work took place at a frenzied pace, with new specimens constantly showing up in Europe from the far corners of the world. The age of exploration, known in the non-Western world as the age of being explored by Europeans, was a time of great discovery. But each new discovery was likely to bring confusion as confirmation. Classification was very disorganized, with resulting names of organisms becoming very long and inconsistent. By introducing the system of binomial nomenclature, which we still use today, genus followed by species, for example, Homo sapiens, Carl von Linné simplified and unified taxonomy. The system relies on shared characteristics by analyzing what organisms have in common in order to create descriptive names and then organizing them into groups or bins. Ultimately, understanding the complex cacophony of life is challenging. If evolutionary changes occur in predictable ways, then it should be possible to organize all of life into this model of life. Modern science owes its understanding of evolutionary processes to the earlier works of luminaries like Linnaeus, who tried to provide order to the living world around him. His approach to taxonomy, the scientific classification of organisms, is a nested hierarchy with kingdoms at the highest taxonomic rank and the most inclusive category. Kingdoms get divided into phyla, then classes, orders, families, genus, and finally species. Like many students, you may have once created a mnemonic device when you first learned this in school. In 1990, Carl Wallace would add a higher taxonomic rank, the domain, because of the discovery of 3 distinct forms of RNA that separate archaebacteria, eukarya, and bacteria from one another, figure below. All other than this change, the system has remained largely unchanged since Linnaeus created it. Though Linnaeus only used this anatomy on the basis of his classification decisions, his scheme has largely been validated through insights later derived from DNA sequencing. In a few cases, small refinements have been provided through genetic insights, but overall, Linnaeus' system provides clarity for the patterns we see. Red fox classification according to the Linnaeus system, including the latter addition of the domain, wolves being to the kingdom Animalia, as the system progresses, and with the genus and species names vulpes. So, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And there's the vulpes for the red fox there. Lamarckism and evolutionary foundations. The theory of evolution provides a robust model for how life changes over time that allows scientists to not only describe what they are observing, but to also test ideas about processes related to speciation, genetic mutation, and similar important topics. However, descent with modification is just part of the story. Determining a mechanism for understanding why some modifications helped create success and others did not would rely on uniting these ideas with the environment in which organisms lived. In late 18th century France, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck tried to explain such observations by attributing parents with the ability to pass on traits or behaviors through the use or disuse of an organ, anatomical feature, or behavior picked up during their lifetime. This late 18th century idea would become quite a popular way to explain the length of a giraffe's neck, for instance, which would become progressively longer during its lifetime as it strained to reach higher branches. This long neck in the parent could then be inherited by the giraffe's offspring. Continued use of this trait would enable further development of this feature. Overall, Lamarck viewed evolution as trending from more simple to more complex forms, because he believed in a naturalist origin of life through spontaneous generation. New life forms, such as microbes, evolved toward more complexity through the generations as they adapted to their environment. His ideas were a major step forward for two reasons. He correctly argued that life took its form through adaptation to the environment, an idea that was quite controversial at the time. Though aspects of his idea would later be proven wrong, the concept of traits being inherited by subsequent generations through natural processes would be a major step forward. Origins of Evolutionary Thought Timeline. Feel free to take a look at that. Revolutionary Ideas, Darwin and Wallace. We've got Alfred Russel Wallace on the left and Charles Darwin on the right there. A new paradigm emerges, Darwin and Wallace. Scientific discovery often occurs over time, but always occurs through the accumulation of data. Thomas Kuhn, in 1962, outlined how scientific revolutions are structured as changes in a paradigm. A paradigm is a pattern of thinking. Old models and theories give way and evolve as new information arises. Sometimes the entire pattern of thinking shifts in a major way, marking an entirely new way of approaching scientific problems. Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace both discovered, pretty much at the same time, the key process that would lead to a new paradigm in evolution. This key process was natural selection. The variation in survival due to advantages and disadvantages in certain traits within an organism. Before Darwin and Wallace, Linnaeus' idea showed the relatedness of life, and Lamarck's idea about inheritance supposed that life has changed over time. These ideas represented the paradigm of the time. Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species in 1859 initiated a major shift in the view of how traits are transmitted from parent to offspring. Rather than parents passing traits directly to offspring through use or disuse, Darwin and Wallace would argue that this occurred through natural selection. Their views on this were influenced by two major factors. First, Thomas Malthus' writings on economic ideas regarding population and resources emphasized that population growth eventually far outstrips available resources in an environment. Second, both Darwin and Wallace had an opportunity to conduct extensive fieldwork in locations filled with biodiversity, relatively untouched by intensive human development. So going back to this sentence here, first, Thomas Malthus' writing on economic ideas regarding population and resources emphasize that population growth eventually far outstrips available resources in an environment. This is very important. As populations grow, eventually the resources available to sustain life are no longer available. So what does an organism do in that environment? Do they just die? Or do they figure out or have the body type that will allow them to adapt to the resources disappearing? And if they can adapt, then they may live long enough to pass on their traits to their offspring. And those offspring then should also be well suited for those changing environmental conditions. While the organisms that did not adapt or did not possess the traits that allowed them to adapt, then they will die off and not pass on their traits to any offspring because they died. All right. Charles Darwin most famously spent 5 years, 1831 through 1836, as a naturalist aboard the Beagle. During this time, Darwin was able to spend extended periods of time on land exploring regions around the South American coast, from Brazil to the Galapagos and beyond. He collected rocks, fossils, animal specimens, plant specimens, and more, sending them on to England prior to his return. These collections made him famous and would become his life's work. Ultimately, the immense variation in plant and animal species across South America was puzzling. He found many completely different species living in environments that were very similar. Why was there such variation across distances in the environments if the environments were so similar? The classic example of this are his observation of finch variations across the Galapagos Islands, Darwin's finches. The best way to characterize this variety was by invoking a common ancestor sometime in the past that, as its descendants moved from island to island, evolved into new species. Another example from this voyage came from his exploration of the Greater Rhea and Lesser Rhea, two flightless birds that local guides often ate as food in the area around Bahia Blanca, Patagonia. These two birds are very similar, but different species. Because one lived north on Rio Negro River and the other south, their ancestors must have pursued separate evolutionary trajectories. Darwin's insights were not relegated only to living specimens. Darwin also collected many fossils. In subsequent study back home, he made connections between living specimens and fossil ancestors. Such evidence would become very important for the development of his ideas around natural selection. The map here shows stops along Charles Darwin's second voyage of the Beagle. Alfred Russel Wallace conducted most of his work in two places. Like Darwin, he spent a great deal of time in South America, particularly Brazil. He also conducted field work in what is today Malaysia, Indonesia, and nearby places. Inspired by the field work of Darwin and others, he funded his expeditions, running between 1848 and 1862, through the sales of collected specimens. He methodically planned his fieldwork to explore ideas he had surrounding biogeography, or the geographic distribution of species. If evolution occurs, he reasoned, closely related species should live close to one another. His fieldwork played this out, noting that rivers and other bodies of water did indeed separate related but distinct species. His classic example, called the Wallace line, notes the separation of species in Asian and Australian Asian descents of the Sunday Strait. There's the Wallace line there. He noted that while some species likely descended from common ancestors and evolved very differently on either side, certain species of flora were the same on both sides, these straits being about 35 kilometers in width. The mobility of an organism was key. Plant pollen and seeds blown by wind or transported by water allow growth on both sides of the strait. Large mammals and most birds, by contrast, could not traverse it. This separation over time would lead to new species where once an ancestral form existed. At the time, Wallace would not have known what we know now about the role of plate tectonics in this biogeographical separation, but he was able to correctly observe here and elsewhere in his work that biological change occurs as new species arise from prior species. He recognized that natural selection as the mechanism for these observations. Favorable traits, or traits that gave organisms an adaptive advantage, were retained, while unfavorable traits would make organisms unfit for their environments. The two men did correspond. While Darwin came to the idea before Wallace, it was in conversation with Wallace that natural selection and the new paradigm that would follow emerged. I'm going to scroll down here to, meanwhile, back in Europe, Mendelian inheritance and genetics take shape. Even with this new understanding of natural selection, it would take an understanding of how genes work to explain how they are inherited by offspring. The foundations for understanding inheritance would come from the 1860s work of an isolated monk in a Czech monastery. While Darwin and Wallace toiled around the globe in the heat of rainforest, an important part of evolutionary theory was taking shape through humble pea plants. Gregor Mendel, the son of a farmer, was very interested in plants. Harnessing his curiosity and focusing on pea plants, he crossbred a wide array of varieties and recorded how traits were passed down in the next generation. Applying his mathematics training, Mendel was able to use statistics applied to pea plant populations to predict which traits smooth skin, wrinkled skin, and so on, would be inherited. As is often the case with new scientific insights, this work was not recognized for its importance right away. But owing to the work, interest, and curiosity of this isolated monk, natural selection was bolstered with genetics. Natural selection would not only be attributed to environmental factors, but could now also be described by changes in how genes are inherited from one generation to the next. The illustration here is titled Characteristics of Pea Plants Mendel Used for His Inheritance Experiments. Continue to scroll down here. Mendel's Laws of Inheritance. You can take a closer look at that on your own. And I'm going to begin reading here. Next paragraph. There are 3 principles in Mendelian genetics. It is also worthy to note, though the term laws here are accepted within the scientific community, there is enough deviation from them that they may be more accurately referred to as principles. Genes come in 2 forms called Alleles, Law of Segregation. Alleles can be dominant, expressed as an organism's appearance, and recessive, not expressed. This is the law of dominance. You may remember creating Punnett squares in previous biology class, as these are a tool that can be used to analyze the expression of one allele over another from one generation to the next. The selection of one allele of a gene over another, however, occurs independently of selection occurring among other genes, law of independent assortment. These laws, however, do not describe how one allele is transmitted to the next generation, only that alleles exist, are treated independently of other genes during selection, and ultimately determine what variants of such genes are physically expressed. For instance, there are cases where one allele is not completely dominant over another, a situation called incomplete dominance. Likewise, there are situations where the phenotypes for both alleles is expressed. This is called codominance. It is also known that some genes exist in nature with more than 2 alleles or multiple alleles. Finally, some traits are actually cogenetic, such as the color of fruit fly eyes, or several genes contribute to a physically expressed variation. All right, to better understand that, definitely for sure, take a look at this short video, just 3 minutes, and I think will help you to understand what I just read, which is probably a little bit confusing. There's a lot of big words in there and kind of complicated ideas, but this video I thought was very helpful. So definitely take a look at that before proceeding with listening to me or doing the reading. Mutation, migration, drift, and natural selection. There are several key processes that drive evolutionary change at all scales. These are genetic mutation, gene migration, genetic drift, horizontal gene transfer, and natural selection. Genetic mutations are simply changes in the sequence of nucleic bases in the coding portion of a DNA molecule. These can be caused by errors in replication or repair of a sequence as it is passed on to the next generation. Gene migration or gene flow works differently. Sometimes a new sexually reproducing individual from a separate population is introduced into a new population of the same species. Introduced traits can include many things, such as new varieties in color within an insect population. This new and unique genetic material mixes into the descendant population and can then lead to unique and novel down generation changes. Genetic material can also be exchanged with the donor population in the same manner as populations subject to gene migration are not necessarily isolated. So this illustration here, gene flow, the transfer of alleles across populations, is depicted here, showing birds from 2 populations living on either sides of a mountain. So species A, bluebirds, contains the dominant alleles, while species B, the redbirds, contains recessive alleles. A number of species A is able to incorporate its allele for blue color into the red population through mating. This is one way that gene flow can work. So when the blue and red mate, you are likely to end up with blue offspring because of the dominance of the allele for blue in this case. Genetic drift does not lead to adaptational changes in a population. Rather, it is the result of chance, most commonly because some individuals have left behind more offspring than others. It is a change in the frequency of an allele over time, and it is completely independent of environmental changes. The genes of the following generations were passed on by those of the individuals fortunate enough to reproduce successfully, and not necessarily of the fittest. One simple example comes in populations reduced to small numbers that then recover, such as the American bison, which was nearly hunted to extinction. While its population is much larger than in the past, its genetic variation is much lower than it was 200 years ago. A simpler example might come from a human couple, each with different eye colors, say brown and blue. But where brown represents the dominant allele, even if the chance of having brown eyes is 50%, all children may statistically end up with blue eyes, thereby eventually erasing the dominant allele. Such cases provide excellent examples of where phrases like survival of the fittest are at best an oversimplification of the evolutionary processes. Here I'm going to skip the text on the right and concentrate on describing the illustration here. Let me scroll down to the caption first. An example of genetic drift using rabbits. Genetic drift allows for the removal of an allele from a population due to chance. Even though the allele frequency for brown and white fur coats is equal in the first generation, the dominant allele for a brown coat quickly displays with more frequency in subsequent generations, eventually eliminating the recessive trait for white coats. So at the top here, first generation, the lowercase p represents the dominant gene, the capital B gene frequency, while lowercase q is lowercase b, or the recessive gene frequency. And we have an equal ratio of the two. So if you counted up the upper and lowercase b's here, they come out to be the same. There are 10 of each. So we have these 5 rabbits with these allele combinations reproducing, and their second generation, you end up with these allele combinations. And now you see that we have more of the dominant than the recessive trait. Only 1 white rabbit here versus 2 from the original population. These 2 rabbits, both with the dominant alleles, BB, uppercase BB and uppercase BB, they mate, and then they produce a third generation, which now has only the dominant alleles and no white rabbits as a result of that. All right, I'm going to scroll through this material here. You can read this if you wish. We'll consider this to be optional. There's some good stuff in here, but I would like to focus on this last bit here, titled A Word About Fitness. Genetic change within populations acts randomly. Natural selection makes it more probable that individuals who are genetically prepared for current or new environmental realities will survive. They are the ones most likely to pass on the genes coded for the traits which permit survival. While genetic changes are random, natural selection is most definitely not random. Adaptations that make an organism fit for a cold climate, such as fur on a polar bear, will not likely be advantageous when the climate warms again at some point in the future. Staphylococcus Aureus, a purveyor of infection throughout the human body, was famously stopped by the antibiotic penicillin, developed by Alexander Fleming in the last century. S. aureus roared back rapidly with resistance a few short years later and has now become so resistant to antibiotic treatments that some strains, such as methicillin resistance, as Aureus, MRSA, are now feared in hospitals, where community infections can spread rapidly among healthy individuals. So take a close look at this video. It's short but quite interesting, the experiment they do there. All right, I'm going to skip over the text below the video. I'm assuming you've watched that. This we will consider optional, and I'm just going to read the final paragraph of the assigned reading. Evolution, making sense of patterns. Like any scientific theory, evolutionary theory is robust, supported by multiple lines of evidence, explains observations made, and allows us to predict and test. As a theory, it does an excellent job of helping us make sense of patterns we see around us in ecosystems, within populations of organisms, among natural systems, and within our own bodies. This cohesive framework is still being adjusted with new discoveries in different ways. It is also providing scientists with directions for research that shines light on the world around us, but research that also leads to critical new medical treatments. Okay, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.